Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristian Hernandez, and I'm a member of Convergence Magazine's editorial board. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our panel, Marx over MAGA, the Socialist Left in the Fight Against Fascism, co-sponsored by Liberation Road. I want to ask everyone here with us tonight to share where you're joining us from. You can do that in the chat. We want to see where people are joining us. Where are y'all at? I know we have some representation all over the country here on the panel, but want to hear where folks are at and joining us from. So make sure to put that in the chat, please. I see there are some folks joining us from St. Louis, from California, from Kansas. Got folks all over. And see Memphis. Hopefully folks are doing okay out there. Thank you so much again for joining us. We want to start tonight's panel by welcoming in people who are feeling intensely anxious about what's at stake or are incredibly tired of hearing that the stakes are higher than ever. Those who are excited about a candidate or about canvassing, and those who are begrudgingly voting. We want to welcome you if you're angry about the lack of choices that we have, electorally or otherwise, or if you're feeling powerless at this moment. We want to welcome anyone who is worried about yourself or your loved ones, whether it's because of your immigration status, because you're needing to stock up on hormones, on birth control pills or abortion pills. And we want to welcome everyone feeling the rage and the grief of this moment over 1 year into the Palestinian genocide and 76 years into the Nakba. I'm very glad that you took time to be here tonight. And no matter how you're joining us or where you're joining us from, I hope you leave tonight with the sense that you are not alone in this fight for a better world. As a Texan, I've seen for myself the rise and danger of the far right, of white supremacist organization, and of the broad radicalization of white men in this country and abroad. Texas is the birthplace of various white supremacist organizations, groups, leaders, including those involved in Charlottesville in the insurrection. And it often feels like Texas is a blueprint for what the GOP and the far right alliance intend for the entire country. Now, 20 days out from the general election, the fight for political democracy feels different, while echoes of 2020 still ring true. Due to the close ties of white Christian nationalism and capitalism, our responsibility as socialists remains firmly to engage in democratic struggles, to defend democracy in our effort to expand it, and to create a path out of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. And while defeating a second Trump presidency is part of that mandate, we know that the cultural, political, and economic forces that manifest as Trumpism won't just go away with his loss. Our level of organization must match our desired level of disruption, and our strategies must align with the reality of the terrain, not as we want it to be, but as it is. And that moment, this moment, requires leadership. And knowing what we know, a strategy of abstention feels apolitical. So this begs the question, within and beyond this election, how can we fight the fascist right while building the power of the left? How can we carry out the work required of us? Tonight, we have three panelists from three organizations of socialists on the front lines discussing shared tactics and strategy. So I want to welcome Renée Paradis from Socialist Majority and DSA, Jayanni Webster of North Star Socialist Organization, and Bennett Carpenter with Liberation Road. Renée is an elections attorney living in Oakland, California, where she works as Associate General Counsel for the Working Families Party. She is currently serving as a member of DSA's National Political Committee and is a founding member of the Socialist Majority Caucus. She has provided legal counsel for numerous progressive and socialist campaigns and candidates, most recently including Jamaal Bowman and Cori, as well as Listen to Michigan, the political committee behind the Michigan Uncommitted campaign. Jayanni currently serves on the leadership committee of North Star Socialist Organization. North Star is a new cadre organization made up of revolutionary socialists connected to mass struggles who are committed to carry out liberatory strategy. She is also an organizer for a national housing and land justice organization and has 13 plus years of experience in student, labor, and community organizing, ranging from anti-death penalty efforts to reproductive justice and campus working organizing. Jayanni is a committed socialist, Black feminist, and internationalist based in her hometown of Memphis, Tennessee. And Bennett is a queer Southern trainer, organizer, and movement strategist, and member of the National Executive Committee of Liberation Road. As lead organizer at Durham for All, they helped build a member-driven IPO that successfully elected movement candidates and worked with them to implement transformative policies around participatory budgeting and community-based alternatives to policing. Bennett holds a PhD from Duke University, where they are a founding member of the Duke Graduate Student Union Local 27. And that is our panel. So let's get into it. So to start us off, I don't want to sound super excited. I'm excited to hear from y'all, but I'm not very excited about why we are here. Today's neo-fascist MAGA movement is not the same old right wing of capitalist consensus. So what's different about today's MAGA right? Why call them neo-fascist? Why does that matter? And are these forces different than they were in 2020? Let's go ahead and get started with Renée.
Thank you, Kristian, and thanks to Convergence. So happy to be here, and obviously the occasion is unfortunate, but being together in community and talking about why we're all doing what we're doing right now helps with the work we all have to do. I would say that the number one thing I think is different in terms of the American context is that the Republican Party in the post-war era was, this uneasy alliance between whether you want to call them international capital or, country club Republicans, Cold Warriors, the executives of Chase Bank, and then, more socially conservative and even just like racist reactionaries, the Birchers in the 50s and so on and so forth. And the first group has been, migrating to the Democrats over the course of the last, couple of decades. And Trump really accelerated that. And while that's happening in part because the racist reactionaries, the Christian nationalists, are ascendant in power. And with the sort of new people that Trump has brought into the party, the sort of MAGA right, his biggest fans who were politicized by Trump, who were sort of apolitical previously, that wing of the party is ascendant. And so we basically have the right-wing fringe that has always existed, but it's now sort of taking over the party, and that means that what the actions they take, the way that they wield power, the things that they're focused on are not just sort of maintaining the business of America as usual, but really trying to repeal the 20th century, particularly with respect to feminism. I mean, I think this is something obviously that's being talked about, but it's really staggering. This is the biggest gender gap election in American history. White women might vote for the Democrats for the first time. I've been making the joke that it's nice for me as like a single white lady professional that I'm finally being directly targeted by the Republicans who are now telling me that I shouldn't have the right to vote because I don't have children and don't have a belief for the future. I mean, this is, some really crazy stuff that has always been there on the right in America, but the power within the party and thus the closeness to state power is, I think, a really key difference. But at the end of the day, I'm just less concerned about vocabulary. I find all of the fights about the F word, the other F word, to be really beside the point almost. There are things that are like quite clearly continuous with the experience of the 1930s in Europe with respect to just, classic fascism, the moment, with the Haitians eating cats and dogs in Springfield was just could not be more classically fascist in terms of stirring up stochastic violence against an other on the basis of, what was essentially a blood libel. And total disinterest in whether or not it's true, what's useful. And then there are things that are different. I mean, I think the effect of social media on conspiracy theories that have always existed, and those kinds of groups, but the sort of total takeover of QAnon of essentially a third of the population is staggering and different. But it doesn't mean that this is any less frightening. And I think part of the social media thing means that all of us get to see how ridiculous some of these people are, right? I listen to a lot of dirtbag leftist podcasts, and they make fun of January 6th all the time. And, the Nazis would have been hilarious, right? Before they took power. There's something about, fascists that makes them sort of ridiculous and cringe, because part of what they're doing is testing out what'll work, testing out what'll happen. So I see a lot of continuity. I see a lot of difference. For me, the reason that I use the word fascist, and I'm happy to use it, is I think it's clarifying to say, this is different, this is worse, this is a really scary moment for those of us that want to oppose the right and don't want to see a neo-fascist takeover of American state power at this particular moment, or indeed any moment.
Thanks, Renee. Absolutely. I think we've all seen, and particularly in the wake of Hurricane Helene and Milton, how conspiracy theorists have sort of run rampant on social media with, suddenly the government having the ability to make hurricanes, and really taking away from the fact that it is actually the capitalist class really exacerbating this climate crisis, resulting in both more intense hurricanes, but also a lack of a safety net for people to, be able to take care of themselves. I want to go to Jayanni to hear, Tennessee, how's it looking different from 2020? Why is it important that we, when we're referring to these forces, that we refer to them as neo-fascist?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of first just want to pick up on something that Renee said in terms of just like classical fascism and what we're looking at today, right? We know that as long as racial and patriarchal capitalism exists, as long as imperialism exists, fascism, both as a political ideology, but also as a social movement, will be an undercurrent in our society. This is going to be a long haul fight. And in North Star, we consider fascism an ultra right wing nationalist tendency that emerges during periods of economic crisis. And I think what's important for us as socialists to look at today is how the MAGA movement in particular has been able to consolidate different factions within the Republican Party. So if you remember, the Republican Party and also the Democratic Party, quite frankly, are not monolithic. There are factions within them fighting for leadership and fighting for influence. And we see how a small faction of the kind of radical Christian nationalists right wing has really seized control of the party. They're hell bent on white minority rule, on mono-religious rule, hell bent on rolling back democratic processes for communities of color and institutionalizing gender oppression. So they have been organizing themselves to steer the ship of this party. And Trump kind of represents, right, the kind of pinnacle of that long march of work. And I think for a place like Tennessee, I'm born and raised in Memphis. People think of Tennessee as a red state, but really people here have been held hostage by the type of conditions and the type of policies and the type of minority rule that the kind of radical Christian nationalists want to bring to the rest of the country, and continue to move it throughout the rest of the country in a way that can be really stifling to the potential of our movement to push forward a revolutionary process for the working class. And so I think, in terms of where we live in Tennessee, we've been saying for a long time, right? The kind of trifecta control that the right wing has over the local, over the executive branch, over the legislature, is really alarming and has consequences. And as long as we're not paying attention to this element within our society, the more we're going to be on the defensive in terms of how we can actually move out of this period into a period of offensive work where we're able to win governing power for everyday people.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I think one thing that, both Renee and Jayanni, you've been mentioning is really the capturing of governance of this institutional power and the ramifications that that has, not only for the policies that are running rampant in this country, but also for the left as we sort of struggle to cohere, to build power. And also just in the wake of, at least on an electoral terrain, some setbacks when it comes to, congressional losses, and also just the inability of the Democrats, whether, intentional in some places or not, to really defend the limited gains that we've made. I want to pass it over to Bennett to hear, how are things different? How are they very much the same since 2020?
Well, one, I just want to say, I think sometimes we have jet lag, right? When it comes to the terminology we use, our terms haven't caught up to the political times that we're in. And so we can be stuck thinking about the Republican and Democratic parties as if they were still the same center left and center right alternatives of a sort of neoliberal establishment as they were for much of the past 40 years. What that fails to grapple with is that neoliberal sort of hegemony is now in a structural crisis, and we're in an interregnum period where we're really fighting over what will come next. And there have been tectonic shifts in the composition of the parties, in who's in leadership of the parties, in terms of what they do. That's a global phenomenon. It's in some ways easier to see in other places, right? Because of the nature of our party system. So to take France, for example, a country that I know fairly well, literally the two parties that had majorities for much of the past 40 years have plummeted to single digits. The Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party, the Republican Party there have been totally eclipsed by the literal rise of the National Front, an actual fascist party, by the emergence of Macron centrists, by the formation of new exciting left alternatives. These are huge, huge political shifts. The thing we have to understand is we've had the same kinds of political shifts in a US context, but because of the peculiarities of our two-party system, those shifts are happening inside the two Democrats and Republicans that I would argue are more fronts than they are actual parties. As Jayanni said, they're multi-tendency, right? And so within the Republican front, the sort of neoliberal establishment that was dominant has been completely eclipsed. The fact that you have someone like Dick Cheney in the Democratic coalition now, people misread that. They say, oh, it's because the Democrats have moved right. Not at all. There's actually been very contradictory things happening inside the Democratic front, including, by the way, the sort of overall rise and strengthening of the progressive wing of the party, even if we have suffered some losses this year. But if Dick Cheney is now out of the Republican camp, it's because the neoliberal establishment has been so deeply eclipsed by currents, white Christian nationalist currents, authoritarian currents, neo-fascist, anti-democratic currents that have long existed in the party, but were minor or subordinate elements. Since 2016, they've taken over the Republican Party, eclipsed the establishment, and 2016 was in many ways the beginning of that process. It's actually taken them these 8 years to really solidify their control over the party apparatus. Whether you think about Trump replacing RNC leadership with his loyalists, et cetera, Project 2025 that I'm so happy is now getting more attention. But that's just one part of a sort of broader consolidation that they've been up to. And so I worry that we don't realize the extent to which 2024 is actually a very different moment from 2016. 2016 was the dress rehearsal in many ways, and if we think about, there's the famous quote in Marx, like the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. In some ways, I think it's the reverse now. As Renee said, fascism can look farcical until it's very serious. And so without denying the horrors of the first Trump administration, they did not have their act together. They do now. They're much more consolidated. And so let's make no mistake that a second Trump presidency would be a tragedy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bennett. I want to sort of touch on something you mentioned about, particularly around France and how we're taking lessons from our international comrades. in this current moment. There's broad agreement among the formations present here about the necessity and utility of a united or popular front at this current moment. So what does that look like for your group in particular, for organizing concretely? And how do these tasks change based on where all of us are joining from today? So Bennett, maybe we can start back with you.
Oh, sure. Listen, I mentioned the system we live in is peculiar and particular. And so because of our first past the post voting system, but also because exceptionally compared to other parliamentary democracies, our political parties do not choose their own candidates, right? Their candidates are chosen through a public vote administered by the state. It's a very strange thing. And so that means to me that, when we talk about the Democratic Party, we really have to be precise in our terms and understand what it is we're talking about. It's actually several different things. But one of them through the primary system is a sort of contest for who will come to be the candidate representing the alternative to a broad front that, as we've named, is increasingly a fascist front, right? In the French system, I talked about that earlier, there's something similar where there's a first and a second round system. In the first round, it's multiple parties competing and contending against each other. In the second round, there's a sort of head-to-head, which increasingly in recent years has become between whoever wins, sort of between the left and the center, and then their version of a fascist right in terms of Le Pen. So we have a similar process here where I think we have to be in this very complicated process of struggle and then unity with a centrist establishment that we are very clear has limitations, that we're very clear is not going to get us where we need to go. Yet we also have to be clear that we have to be able to unite with them while building our own independent political organization and political power. There's lots more I want to add about that, and so we can see kind of where we go in the conversation. But I was struck recently. I was reading a response to our Liberation Road's Block, Broad, and Build paper, which was our kind of position paper on the 2024 elections, where we say, as many folks are, we've got to block the fascist right, unite inside this broad coalition, including with centrist Democrats, while building the independent power and initiative of the left. And part of what we argued is, if we do that successfully, we're actually inside that front with Democrats. We're building our own power. We're winning more people to our positions. We're improving our position. There was a discussion by Bread and Roses where one of the panelists on their panel said, oh, well, that seems like a total fantasy to me. There's no way that we can do that. And it was just so striking to me because what we're talking about here is not a hypothetical, right? This is not an untested hypothesis. It's actually something that many of our folks are doing. Many of our members are active in helping build and strengthen IPO projects all around the country. My own experience has been here in North Carolina, where we've been really skilling up and doing that, including starting at a local level, running issue campaigns, running candidates, connecting that work together. You mentioned in my bio that we had huge victories, the largest housing bond in North Carolina history that we were able to pass in Durham. A huge participatory budgeting project, the creation of a whole new Department of Community Safety doing cutting edge work around alternatives to policing, in North Carolina. And of course, in doing that work and electing left candidates to local office, we came into struggles with centrist Democrats and neoliberal Democrats. And yet, we're in North Carolina, and we have to put aside those fights when necessary in general elections and state-level elections to contest against a neo-Confederate front that has taken over our state, and is trying to crush us all. And so that dance is one that we are in the process of doing. As our IPOs have, kind of built up and scaled up and expanded our reach, our ability to reach voters, we're knocking hundreds of thousands of doors. You really do start to attract, more of a center of gravity. More donors, more dollars, more volunteers are like, hey, here's these people doing this work really well. So it is very possible, while working inside a front, to elect, among other people, folks like Kamala Harris, it is very much possible to build independent political organization and initiative and power. And many of us are in the process of doing just that, without denying the challenges and complexities of that work.
Absolutely. I think, folks are mentioning in the comments that so much of this work, yes, is playing out on a federal level, on a national scale, but really the challenges and the tensions that you're talking about happen at a local level and are being dealt with by folks present on this call and on the panel, very much locally, very much every day, and navigating those tensions is part of the necessary work. So I want to pass it over to Jayanni to hear, how is that happening in Memphis? What does that local work look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speak too much about Memphis specifically. I mean, I want to take a much broader view of what it looks like to fight against fascist forces today while also being a part of the United Front against fascism. And I think in some ways, we have to get in position as a left. We have to rebuild a fighting left, as Bennett has pointed out, that can offer itself as a real alternative to the horrors that people are living in and suffering in. In Memphis, just like in many communities, there is a growing Palestine solidarity and Palestine liberation movement. In Memphis, there is tenant union organizing. There is labor union organizing. There's all sorts of work that you can see happening across many, many states. I think for me as an organizer, I'm always asking myself the question of, why aren't these efforts enough? I think part of the reason why I became a revolutionary is because I was doing the work every day in the trenches, in housing, in labor, in immigration justice, and it wasn't adding up to the type of scale and the type of advancement that our people really need to actually stop the day in and day out suffering that folks are subjected to under a system that is exploiting their labor, that is exploiting their communities where they call home. And so I do think kind of what Bennett is saying, like, supporting IPOs, these independent political organizations, of which we do have in Memphis. We have a local IPO, and they're in places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And we need to support those institutions as well as we do the work of supporting uprisings and mobilizations to advance the fight, for some of the issues that our people rely on. And so I think being in the street, but also being able to support IPOs is going to be very, very important in this time. And I think no matter the result of the 2024 election, the left will be called upon to really deepen our base. In fact, I've been saying this for many years. Many of us have been saying this for many years, that we need to win bigger campaigns. We need to expand our command of the state and to mobilize millions of people, not the 10,000 people that we can pull onto a call, not the 5,000 people who are in our base. We need millions of people organized to fight for real solutions to the deep, persistent problems that are facing us. And so we can only do that if our movements are less fractured than they are right now. And we can only do that if we're doing deep base building, winning the trust of our people, earning that trust, testing mass line, and helping to catalyze leadership and collective power. So in North Star, we talk about, the block and build is an approach that allows us to block the most reactionary elements that could really undermine the process that we're trying to engage society in, which is about getting us closer towards a type of transition in our economy and in our society that makes it possible for socialism to take root. And so if you think about the long game and the long arc of where we're trying to go, we're going to have to block reactionary elements, and we're going to have to build ourselves. And there's a way in which elections play a role in that, as well as base building. And, you know, we're going to have to fight electorally, no matter which way you slice this apple. Essentially, right, we're going to need to be able to figure out how to continue to catalyze elections in a way that can strengthen the work that we're doing. We have our constraints, right? The two-party system, we did not choose it, but we still have to make sure we're utilizing the best of what we can get out of that system. And so I think the fight in Memphis is similar to the fight in Chicago, is similar to the fight in Durham, is similar to the fight in Miami, or what have you. We need to be able to support both how we navigate and align ourselves with the United Front to block neo-fascism, while also expressing our independence and building ourselves to offer real alternatives, so that we are amassing enough strength and power and political influence to actually get to an eventual position of a break, where we can actually break off or seize control of an apparatus in a way that is different, like qualitatively different than what we're facing, and being in a fractured and weakened state as a left and as a social movement left.
100%. I totally agree. We need to win bigger. You know, I do not share the view of the far right that the left should be smaller and less effective and fringe. I want us to be big. I know we need masses, and that requires, you know, showing up to all the fights that are on the table. I want to, you know, sort of touch on some of what you were saying with you know, the building of independent structures while also defending. And there are absolutely criticisms of the block and build approach, you know, who say we should just be focused on building an independent party. And so I want to hear from Renée, like, how do you respond to that? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'll take this opportunity of being the first person to speak to answer the last question a little bit in my response. You know, my initial, you know, response to the independent party thing is just, you know, it's the structure of the United States' electoral system, first past the post, single member districts, you know, the Electoral College, the Senate, all of this, it necessarily produces like a two-party system, right? The two-party system is not something that the, you know, secret leaders of America, you know, sit in a cabal and decide. It's a consequence of the material circumstances of our elections. I remember very distinctly in a law school class, you know, a professor of mine saying, everybody loves to talk about how the US should move towards proportional representation. But, you know, he said, I actually prefer the American system because you see what ruling coalitions the parties will form before you vote for them, right? So you get to see sort of how the people you're voting for are going to break your heart. And, you know, Bennett's comments in particular have picked up on this, right, that we have this duopoly and it obscures a lot of the differences that would be, you know, really palpable in a multi-party system. But in a multi-party system, you vote for your party, right? And then they, after the election, have to form a majority coalition. And so they will inevitably, if you vote for the far left, you're going to end up with a center left government because we just don't have a majority of Americans with us. So when we talk about an independent party, I think, you know, people like it because it sounds like a shortcut and it's really easy to explain and understand. But I think it's a real abdication of the responsibility we as socialists owe to like accurately understand our world and, you know, make choices based on what is rather than what we wish were. But I don't want to, you know, I would say, I think the only way forward is, you know, the party surrogate model of independent political organizations that develop the infrastructure of a party and run people, you know, to the left. It's why I work for WFP and spend all of my, waking hours organizing in DSA, right? Like that's the electoral strategy of both of them. It's something I like really believe in terms of moving all of us to a more just and equitable future. But, the Democratic Party does not see us, right, as part of their coalition that they need to negotiate with. They saw Bernie and AOC as people they needed to negotiate with in 2020 because of the primary campaign, but they don't recognize social movements that are, the left as being something that they really need to negotiate with, nor do we have the kind of left that could effectively negotiate, right? If we wanted to say everybody who wants us to stop arms to Israel, we're all gonna together go do this thing, right? Whether it's we decided not to vote for Kamala unless she changed her mind. Who would decide that and enforce it, right? Like what kind of organization has the buy-in for individual voters, activists, organizers, socialists to be able to move collectively as one body? I'm in the non-cadre organizations on the panel, and we can't get anybody to do anything unless they want to do it in the organizations I'm in. And so one of the problems with the sort of with the model of being sort of the junior partner in a united front or a popular front is the other people in the front have to agree to be working with you. And I think what we've seen from Kamala Harris's campaign over the course of the last few weeks and months is disinterest. And it's like we scheduled the Popular Front meeting and they didn't show up. And that's it's a real difficulty for the strategy. And I guess what I would say is I think the only possible strategy is this one, because I think a third party is a dead end for just very basic structural reasons around the way that American democracy works. Just the legal and political structures, they're going to give rise to the two-party system. But just because it's the only thing that we can do that's going to be effective in the terms that we need it to be effective, doesn't mean it isn't difficult and hard and doesn't involve a lot of really tricky questions. The issue, obviously it's right, like the issue of Palestine is the one that has dominated certainly my organizing work for the past, my entire NPC term, and it's been a really amazing movement, right? Like I think that because we have failed in any appreciable, measurement of success over the course of the last year, I think it's really easy to get nihilistic about it. But in fact, we're seeing a majority of Americans who are for a ceasefire, or majority of Democrats for an arms embargo. We've made like huge strides, but capturing all those people into believing this doesn't mean that we've moved the party enough to get what we want. And so now we're in the position of having to work to elect someone who has said, screw you to us. And I do think if we had a multi-party system, we could have threatened to bolt from the coalition, and they would have had to do a snap election or change policy. And we can't do that. We're not as powerful as we would be in a different system. But the answer to that is not to become even more powerless. The answer is to live with the world to organize in the world we live in and put our energy into dealing with these contradictions, dealing with these difficulties, dealing with how we work with a group of people who are uninterested in working with us. Figuring that out is our task. Our task is not retreating into, well, this is hard, this is complicated, this makes me feel bad, so I'm going to do something that's a total loser and doesn't build power for the people that I claim I want to help.
Kristian, can I say something real quick on this party question? I think all these discussions, do we build a new party? Do we stay within this party? Do we break with the Democratic Party? Is it a clean break? Is it a dirty break? We're making a category error because the Democratic Party is not a party in the strong sense of the term. And so we need to clarify our terminology. If by party, we mean a membership-based organization that chooses a political program, selects folks to run for office on that program, through internal processes, the Democratic Party is not that. I think we're making, like, we just make a mistake, you know, in thinking of it as such. And so that's not to say that there aren't, you know, I mean, again, there's not a dues-paying membership based, there's not a program that is binding. The party itself does not have control over or get to select its own candidates. Remarkably, you know, the party does not get to say, here's who we want to represent us. We as voters do. It's a very, very peculiar institution. So that's not to say that there aren't real apparatuses inside what we call the Democratic Party that exist, that are strong, that oppose us, that we have to contend against. But we need to actually, I think, start sharpening and clarifying which parts of it we're talking about. Are we talking about the DNC? Are we talking about state level parties? Are we talking about the local delegates? Are we talking about people elected as Democrats? Which ones? Because they have a range of positions. Are we talking about everyone with a, you know, D next to their name on their voter registration? And once we start nuancing and making more precise which of those things we're talking about, I think we can actually have way more interesting and strategic conversations. The question of how in Beaufort County, Eastern North Carolina, should leftists relate to the local Democratic Party chapter president is, to me, a much more interesting question than how, you know, how can socialists as a whole engage with the party as a institution.
Yes, I I feel like this could have been a whole separate panel on the question of the party question. I know we're going to move into Q&A soon, and apologies if you hear my dog barking. He's very agitated. I don't know why. But I want to make sure that for folks tuning in, make sure to leave your questions in the chat so we'll pull some questions from there. You know, from folks listening and tuning in. One thing I want to really hear about, because I think all of what's being said, sometimes it feels like the left is often just like talking to itself, and we're having these squabbles internally and fighting each other, because it's sometimes easy, sometimes it's manageable, but also it can be hard to break out of sort of the vacuum or bubble of the left, and making sure that both our messaging and the audiences that we're speaking to and dialoguing with go beyond sometimes they go beyond labels, sometimes they are in various spaces. Most people do not have super coherent politics. And so when it comes to our messaging and how we actually reach people, making sure we're moving past both like the fear mongering of the right, moving past the condescension of what I often get from like sort of the mainstream Democratic national, you know, the party on a national level. How do we have these conversations with people who largely maybe don't agree with us at face value, but there is some sort of like, hey, we're part of the working class. How can we make sure that our messages are resonating and reaching, you know, the masses that we've all talked about needing? So I'm going to start with Jayanni for that one.
Yeah, I was hoping someone else might start, but I'm happy to kick us off with just a few thoughts. I don't find that what we have to say as a left, right, that we want a world where people have fresh food to eat, where people have access to free health care, where people have access to quality schools and children can grow up in safe neighborhoods, that we have an economy that is based on the development of people instead of the exploitation of their labor. I don't think any of those things are controversial, or they are things that we are going to have to wrestle with everyday people around. I think what is happening is people are looking for an understanding and an explanation for why those things are not true. Why are these things happening in our society that seem to contradict life itself? The planet being destroyed, right? Species not being able to rehabilitate and come back from destruction. I think there are ways in which we need to do the work of telling our people the truth about what is happening in society. And we need to be able to offer a pathway out of current conditions. I think those are the types of conversations we have, because when you start having those conversations, that's when the pessimism comes in, or the I'm not sure if anything can ever change, or I'm not exactly sure that things can be overcome, or it's all just the same. You know, I've been on this planet for 40 years, nothing's it gets worse and worse every year, that sort of thing. The kind of there is no alternative is something that is instilled, right, in our people. Not just from narrative, not just from what they see on TV, not from what they consume commercial wise, but it also comes from their material reality. Things don't seem to be getting better for people. And so I think being able to talk about why, and to talk about that there is a pathway, and to be able to actually demonstrate what it looks like to bring people out of isolation and into collective power, to do something that can have a material impact on their lives, is where we start to have that. I think there is a place for narrative strategy. I think there's a place for the type of messaging that we put out, because YouTube is probably out organizing most segments of the left. There's so much content on there that people are consuming and being confused by. And so I do think, like, being able to have those conversations about alternatives. You know, I was on the doors in North Carolina just a month or so ago. And I think what was really helpful in those conversations was talking about the task at hand, right? We need to defeat Trump, which necessitates that Harris wins, but that the real kind of turning of the corner is how we can move them into organization, how we can move them into action and into organizing their neighbors around the issues that impact them every day, and building that kind of people community-based power. And I think that was kind of the kind of light at the end of the tunnel for most of the conversations that we had, where people were like, yeah, I'm not excited about this election. I know what I got to do, but whatever. And it's like, no, our people, we cannot allow our people to be stuck there. So I think being able to have the conversation that bridges the two is the kind of narrative work that we need, like in the trenches, and talking with people every day.
Amazing. I'm glad you went first. I think encompassed that super well, especially just, I mean, really summing it down to our duty is to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how nuanced it can be, and understanding that sometimes there are various things that are happening that are true all at once, while seemingly contradictory. It's super important because there's so much misinformation, disinformation campaigns that are happening, bombarded with it. On top of that, most people see themselves primarily as consumers, not as workers. And that makes it really difficult when we're having, these public fights. I'm thinking about like the longshoreman fight, for example, the strike, and like what that could have meant had, it gone longer and disrupted people's, ability to get their packages on time, or gas shortages, and really sort of like, hurt our ability to build the types of solidarity that we need, that are not being felt in this moment. And I ask about the messaging, because one thing that really struck me is, with everything happening with the hurricanes, and a lot of the disinformation around, FEMA, and whether or not Biden, showed up, or what he was doing. There were independent efforts, both from organizations, but from individuals, to really get out there and take care of people, regardless of political affiliation, and sort of like the baseline of understanding, of like this mutualism that needs to happen, in moments of crisis, that are very clear often in those types of crises, but less clear when the crisis is like everywhere. Is capitalism feels a little bit both intangible and not concrete, but yet very concrete, for many of us here. So I also want to, make sure, to hear from Renée on, messaging wise, like what does this mean, for not just the election, but going beyond the election, regardless of sort of the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we're thinking about like what how should we message what we're doing? I mean, there are a number of different things we're doing and a number of different, groups that we need to message to. But, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is, the part of the reason that we don't see broad support for socialism is just the relative wealth of Americans, right? That we know there are a lot of people who are struggling, and that more and more are struggling all the time. But in a global sort of historic thing, the median American voter is not someone, they're not like a 19th century mill worker. They're not sort of classic, proletarian who needs to, rise up with the coworkers at the factory. So, when we're thinking about how we appeal to them and how we build, socialism, I think we need to be really clear about what we're doing when, right? And when we're running a candidate, when we're supporting a candidate, right, there's the messaging that we need on the doors to win that election. And then there's the messaging that we want to be using to build support for our position going forward. And I think the way to do that, and I think we've seen it with the success of the Bernie campaign in 2016 with the Medicare for All slogan, right, is that you make it around the policy, right? And the policy is intrinsically socialist, right? Like universal government, provided healthcare is a socialist policy, but it's also, it can be sold as common sense. It's something that a lot of different constituencies, a lot of different groups can support. DSA has had a lot of success in particularly states with like closed primaries, with running these sort of socialists in the Democratic primary, and then, becoming a legislative caucus, particularly in New York State. And, when we win those races, we're winning them not just with people who voted for Bernie or people who would consider themselves socialists. We're winning it with people who would consider themselves progressive, who voted for Elizabeth Warren, who are to our right. And then when we're thinking about sort of who do we want to bring into the movement and how do we want to build the movement, I think we should also be thinking about people who are depoliticized, right? Like I always, this is not a new thing, right? I'm thinking of the Fox Pivens work on, why Americans don't vote. The people who aren't voting, who are outside of the electoral system, right? That's going to be a very different message that we want to give to them when we're trying to encourage them maybe to vote or to register or to get engaged, right? And then when we're talking to people who are in the labor movement or in, the progressive political movement, who are socialists, but who aren't members of our organization, who aren't in an organization where they're sort of organizing outside of their day job or organizing in an explicitly socialist way, then that's another different message, right? And so I think that for me, I am like a very concrete thinker and organizer. And so for me, I would bring it back always to what is the thing that you are going to be able to give to this person if we all work together? Like, what can we collectively do for ourselves in this context? And that may be like a very simple thing if you're running for state legislature and this is what you can get through the state legislature. And it may be an absence of a thing, right? Like, we're going to vote for Kamala, not because we think that she's great, but because we want to create the terrain for us to do these other things on, right? But bringing it back to that immense practicality, because everybody hates their boss and their landlord if they have them. Not me. I love my bosses.
Some universal, maybe not so universal truths there. And I think absolutely, as we're sort of moving our discussion into answering some of the questions that have popped up from folks tuning in, and again, feel free to drop any questions that you still might have in the chat. We'll hopefully can get to them. But I want to really make sure we touch on something that I think has been a big discussion. It's gotten pretty heated and has created both tensions and contradictions on the left, and that's the the big question in the room of both the election and like what it means for the people of Palestine and the ongoing genocide. So we have a question from Rico. Thank you for your question. And they say, the strongest popular movement in the US today has been the Palestinian freedom struggle that has captured so many people, especially youth, and without question, Palestinians and Muslims. Those folks have made clear that they are not voting for Kamala. This is a contradiction among the people between that movement and the Block and Build movement. How do we resolve that? So I'm going to pass it to Bennett to get us started on that question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question a lot. And I think the first thing I'll say is if there are contradictions there. I do not think it's maybe quite as stark a contradiction as the way the question poses it. There are plenty of people deeply involved in the Palestinian freedom struggle who will reluctantly cast a vote for Kamala Harris this November. There are plenty who absolutely will not. And certainly talking about youth here in North Carolina, I know many folks, 19, 20, 21, who are both deeply involved in the campus-based movements to stop the genocide, and also involved in campus-based movements to register voters and get out the vote. So again, there's contradictions, but I don't think they are quite as stark as has been posed there. I have not yet, I will say, and I've had many deep conversations about this, I have yet to hear a single person who has a case for any way in which a MAGA victory or a Trump victory would be anything less, like could possibly improve either the actual situation right now in Palestine, the future for it, or our room to maneuver to change conditions. So I do think that's very important to note. I mean, I think it's one of the things we should really worry about with a MAGA victory is what will happen with a situation in West Asia. But having said that, when we talk about an inside-outside strategy, I think we're in the unfortunate position as socialists who engage in electoral politics, talking with other socialists who maybe don't. We often have to defend the electoral part of it, and that can give the impression that that's the only piece of it. An inside-outside strategy is that both and, right? How are we both out on the streets in our millions and marching in our thousands together to the voting booth to cast votes as an expression of our power? How do we hold that balance? I think often it's actually literally everyone who, like, people are doing both of those things. And sometimes there's a division of labor, right? As a trainer, I've trained candidates and I've trained organizers, and like their different roles. Part of that training was getting them together and being like, what does it look like to understand the different roles we're playing in this moment? I had a long conversation with Adir Kampa at the Socialism Conference recently, who's Palestinian American based in Tennessee, who was like, in this moment, my role is not to be voting for Kamala Harris. I'm like, that's fine. Like we can have different lanes in this struggle. I am not here trying to convince a Palestinian person devastated by this ongoing genocide that like what they need to be focusing on is electoral organizing in this moment. Other folks can hold down that lane. They can be pursuing the work that they're up to, and we can understand how do we actually connect and combine and coordinate those efforts so that we're jointly working to improve our terrain, both by all the mechanisms that we're going to need. Because I do genuinely think that it is possible in this moment through mass mobilization to change conditions in Gaza. I want to be very clear about that. And to fundamentally change the deeper underlying orientation of American foreign policy is a much bigger fight that is the culmination of a long-term governing power strategy. It is not something that we can accomplish next year, but it is also not something we can accomplish by sitting out the fight. Renee talked earlier about how, unfortunately and infuriatingly, uncommitted organizers haven't been able to get Kamala's team to sit down with them. And I'll say, like, here in North Carolina, our state party, Democratic Party chair, Anderson Clayton, was one of, I think, 3 state parties to endorse an immediate ceasefire now and stand behind those demands. And so when we're talking, who, by the way, who ran a sort of insurgent progressive campaign to win that position of party chair. And so when we're talking about this power building strategy, it's like, we don't have the power yet, unfortunately, at the level of the presidential race to shift that policy. But hey, it turns out we have the power to shift it at this level, through this bastion, through this state party. And how do we think about building that power up and understand that it's going to take militant mass movements working inside and outside the electoral system?
Thanks so much, Bennett. Definitely a delicate dance, I would say, with trying to navigate both that question and understanding where both people are coming from, but also how to have productive conversations about strategy on this particular question. So I want to hear from Jayanni of what her thoughts are on this question.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that Bennett put out. I think it's a really great question. It's one that, as socialists, as folks who are organizers, who are, committed to the block and build approach and strategy, I think that, we also have to consider that a lot of people of color and a lot of folks in the working class are moving towards the GOP, right? Especially young men of color are moving towards the MAGA movement. Black, Latino, Asian men are being captured by this movement. And so just kind of want to pull on that thread too, that, I think the natural tension that exists here between those who, because of their position around what is happening in Palestine, around the genocide, are not going to vote for Harris. I think that there is a relationship between how Bennett put it, like the mass mobilizations and the resistance effort and what folks are doing in the inside. And I think our left is so fractured and so used to seeing tension, like natural tension sometimes, as a place where then we can't sit down and try to figure out where there are areas in which we can actually align our approach, our tactics. I want to hear more about that. I want to see more conversations about where we can actually merge our efforts in a way that adds up to more than just the kind of efforts that are happening in silos sometimes. But I think it's really critical to realize right now that the MAGA movement is growing rapidly, and our base, right, our social sectors are up for grabs right now by this white Christian nationalist movement that is not going to serve them. And I think, there are some of us who need to be on the front lines of that struggle. And there are going to be those of us who are going to be on the front lines of different struggles. But I think it's actually imperative for us to think about the connection and the relationship between them, and talk about how sometimes tensions can be resolved to actually advance the work of rebuilding the left overall.
100%. And I think, again, I want to echo, it's really difficult because I do also often in the course of these conversations, as you said, like there need to be more conversations, but as they're happening, it does sometimes feel like there's a impulse to sort of speak in a passive voice of like, oh, well, these are the things that are they're like, this is inevitable. And I think for me, as a socialist, as an organizer, I'm like, the only thing that's inevitable is that this is not working anymore, and that there will hit a breaking point, and that another world has to happen. And I think making sure that we're imbuing in our organizing a culture of both just not only solidarity but hope, in the ability for these things to happen. And our ability to sort of build trust with each other in the course of that, meaning like, hey, we're going to try it this way. You can do it this way. At the end of the day, like we're still on the same team, and we still are fighting against the same thing. So I want to hear, Renee, I know you were pretty involved in the Uncommitted work. And so, want to hear what those conversations have looked like.
Yeah. So, I had the experience of a couple of weeks ago, the DSA, National Political Committee, the national leadership body of which I'm a member, was voting on a resolution brought forward called No Votes for Genocide that would essentially commit the organization to making an anti-endorsement of Harris. And I voted against that, as did everybody else in Socialist Majority and Groundwork. And we were joined by the Bread and Roses caucus that Bennett spoke about earlier to block it. And got a lot of pushback from some of the most online members of DSA. And then, 3 or 4 days later, I was in the partner meeting with the leadership of the Uncommitted National Movement, who are the Listen to Michigan folks. And they were letting down easy their movement partners around the fact that they wouldn't be endorsing Harris, that basically because she had not met with them and they had not gotten the speaker, that they couldn't endorse, they couldn't mobilize, but they were essentially recommending a vote for her without saying that. They said it would be incredibly terrible if Trump won, and don't throw away your vote on a third party. And so, they were saying to everybody, we know that this might be a disappointment to some of our partners, that they're not sort of coming home and endorsing Harris. It was a really funny, moment to see, just one sort of step left and one step right. And this is what people are being worried about getting pushback for. But, I think that the framing of this that suggests that all Palestinians, all Muslims, all Arabs are not voting for Harris, and that anybody who is voting for Harris or encouraging others to vote for Harris is betraying the Palestinian people, I think is a really toxic way to talk about the very hard choices that we're all making in this moment. And I think that a lot of it comes from, and whenever I say that the Palestine solidarity movement of the last year has been a failure, people get understandably frustrated because they're like, you have to up organizing, and it has, moved the needle in terms of labor support for a ceasefire and political support for a ceasefire and popular support for a ceasefire. And I don't want to in any way denigrate any of that. And there's the counterfactual of what if none of this had happened? Would it be worse? But in terms of the goals of stopping the genocide, we are no closer. And that's what I meant by failure, just because I did see some discussion of that in the comments. But I think that failure ultimately is, all of it, the vibes are terrible, right? It feels kind of frivolous to talk about the experience of witnessing something that is happening to people. But witnessing a genocide being carried out in your name, and witnessing in this really immediate way that social media brings all of these horrors home, it feels terrible to not be able to do anything about it, and to have this be something that you're complicit in. We're all complicit in it. If you live in America, if you're an American citizen or a permanent resident, you are benefiting from the system of empire that does this. You can't opt out. There's no way to opt out. You could give up your citizenship and you could expatriate, but that's it, And so, and even then, you'll still be a former American citizen and have that. And so I understand the desire to want to opt out. And I think the people who are, and to be clear, I would not try to convince anybody who sees themselves in the people of Palestine to vote for Harris. I think that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who are responding to this terrible situation that we're in, where we have to support a party that is currently doing something we find unbearable, just absolutely unbearable. That's tough. I wish that the people who believe in abstentionism would not frame it as the only moral choice, and I think that they're doing that out of this deep distress, this deep horror. And I think if you're talking about practicality, if you're in the realm of what we need to do and what will make the world better, Harris winning is the clear answer there. That's not the conversation that a lot of people are having. I think that's fine if you morally are unable to vote for Harris. I understand that. It's not the choice I would make. And I would even, if you were on the doors, try and, convince you otherwise. But I'm not doing that in the public sphere. What I am really frustrated with is the way this has become a way to flatten and distort these very complicated questions in front of us.
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, I think we absolutely in this moment need to maybe just ground ourselves in our responsibility and our duty as socialists, as organizers, to both understand the current terrain as it is, lay out the choices that people have, as limited as they might be by the constraints of the institutions that we're bound to, and let folks make those choices, make those informed choices. And I think ultimately it's tough because it's not easy to see, and to your point, to feel like there's nothing that can be done. But I do think that it makes, at least for me, makes me more resolved to be committed to an organized left, to being ruthlessly effective, and to be militant, to really engage more and more people, as difficult and as uncomfortable as it might be, and really sort of like understand at the baseline the humanity that is being both threatened and undermined by the capitalist class on a day-to-day basis. I appreciate everybody's comments. I know that's like a very tough subject, again, not only because of the rage and grief we are all feeling, but also because it's astounding to just sort of see the way that history repeats itself, but also knowing that we almost have like a unique role as Americans to really engage in some of these fights within the belly of the beast, and know that like that is what the institution is. So I know, at least for me, like I don't think I've ever really cast a moral vote for president by the nature of what the country was founded on, and everything that it represents. So to me, it's not necessarily a moral question. Yeah, I think thinking through, but I know folks have various opinions there. I want to address some other questions that folks have brought up in the chat, and maybe combine a couple of those. I think many of us have probably engaged in some type of scenario planning, particularly for the election, knowing that there's two outcomes. I don't think there's a secret third thing that's just going to pop up. So we're either going to see a Trump victory or a Harris victory. And what does that look like for us post-election? Are we thinking there will be a, quote, peaceful transfer of power? I know that's been a big focus during the debates. What does it mean for us as our responsibility if Harris does win? How do we continue fighting against fascism? Because it won't just go away regardless of who wins. So I'm going to start with Bennett on that one.
Well, the first thing I want to say is, alongside the horror and hopelessness of this moment and the very hard things and the very scary things, I think we also have to hold on to hope as a practice, and we have to give our people hope. That includes, tell no lies, claim no easy victories, right? So it includes acknowledging the real losses we're talking about. But it also, we need to look at the places where we actually are shifting the needle, and where maybe we have more power than we're realizing or admitting. I said at the Socialism Conference, when we did a different version of this panel, I think inside the sort of democratic tent, the broad pro-democracy coalition, if you will, there's three areas where we're really not winning right now, and it's immigration, incarceration, and imperialism. And that's very, 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 very hard. Also, there are other places where we are winning the internal war of position inside the pro-democracy front, inside the Democratic Party. We're winning that war internally on bodily autonomy. We're winning that war on abortion access, on trans-affirming care. There are places where the Democratic Party as a whole, at the level of the electeds and the voting base, has dramatically shifted. So I want us to hold on to that complexity, and also to those places we've made inroads. I'm so glad someone in the chat referenced ACT UP, because when we're talking about an inside-outside strategy, what a brilliant example of a mass movement in a moment also horror and despair and a different kind of genocide against queer populations and a different kind of indifference from the state, was able to use both disruptive direct action and inside strategy, and an electoral strategy and a lobbying strategy to shift the needle and change the needle. One of the things that puts us in the place we are today, where a much larger percentage of this country is much more open to affirming the rights and freedoms of queer people, even as we're now experiencing the pushback. But I want to hold on to that and say that when we're fighting in this election, we are fighting defensive battles. In North Carolina, I'm fighting for my adopted trans godson to still have ability to have care. I'm fighting so that we don't have deportations starting up again in North Carolina, because post 2016 we actually had a breathing room from that. But I'm also fighting for those offensive battles of what happens in a place like Minnesota, where with a 1-vote Democratic majority, in 4 months they passed free lunch for school children, 12 weeks paid parental leave, free public college tuition, unionization rights, universal driver's license access for undocumented folks, an expanded public health care option, all of these things. And that wasn't just because they had a 1-vote majority. It was because for a decade plus, the same strategy we're talking about had been happening, of building the power of social movements, building an agenda, of building elected allies in office. So I want us to hold on to the things we're fighting for. I think there are actually more than 2 scenarios, unfortunately, at the federal level, because a Harris presidency with majorities in the Senate and House is a very different thing than without those. Same thing on the side of MAGA. And unfortunately, there's also other versions where the results are contested and we're in a really bad situation. But if we have governing majorities in both chambers and the presidency, I think it's imperative that the left be thinking right now about where we can push and go on the offensive. And that's a combination of thinking about where actually have we consolidated even the centrist Democrats. And so we actually might be able to really move them quite quickly, as well as those places where we haven't. North Star said we need to get together and be thinking about 3 to 5 key demands or something like that that we would be pushing. I think that's really imperative in this moment. If we are faced with a MAGA sweep at the federal level, I think we are in a very, very dangerous situation. I think people are really, so many of us are so caught up in the work right now, whether that's electoral organizing or anti-genocide mobilization, that we haven't even had the bandwidth to do the kind of internal security reviews and planning and preparation we need to do, because we have to take, I think, MAGA very seriously in their promise to aggressively crack down on their enemies without and within, which includes for sure the socialist left, includes, I think, potentially sweeping deportations of immigrants and undocumented people, includes an onslaught on trans folks. So there's a lot, I think, that we will need to explore. And I was struck recently in a conversation on sort of solidarity with the situation in Ukraine. There was a expert on Russia from Russia, I think not living there now, who joined the call from Eastern Europe, who said, "Oh, what I'm seeing right now in the U.S. reminds me of things I saw in Putin's Russia 10 years ago, whatever." So it was and sort of listing them out. So I think we do need to prepare for the possibilities of what things could look like under a right authoritarian regime. We unfortunately, we have examples in other places in the world that we can look to, and we can connect with actual socialists on the ground in those places to learn from them. And I think it will be important inside of that to remember that a key distinction is a majority of this country is not on board with the fascist MAGA agenda. And so in that moment, we actually have a lot of people that we can potentially bring in. And the moments when I think the left has most effectively led the centrist Democratic folks is in those moments. I can remember post 2016 being at a mass protest outside the Durham airport, connected to the immigrant ban that was happening then, where we took over the highway and blocked it, which I've done many times. But suddenly we had suburban soccer moms taking over the highway with us. I was like, oh, something is happening now that even these people are willing to take this action. So I think in terms of evaluating the assets we'll have, we have to think about the protection we have from being part of those broad mass movements. Some of my comrades who were involved in the Communist Party in the 1950s under McCarthyism pointed out that the CPUSA, they thought, made a really big mistake in closing its southern chapters and going underground when the McCarthy period started, and that actually lost them safety. They thought it would make them more safe, but it made them more vulnerable. And in hindsight, they said we should have been louder, more visible, more connected with the people, because that's what's going to keep us safe. So I encourage folks to think about doing something similar.
100%. Yeah, in the immigrant rights movement, we often would say sin miedo, like we have to be able to do this work unapologetically, because it's normal. It's the right thing to do. I want to hear also from Jayanni on this question. What does scenario planning look like right now? What are the outcomes that we should be thinking about within the next 20 days?
Yeah, I mean, I think one part is talking about the scenarios, and then I also want to talk about like the real imperative for people to actually get into the swing states. But first, I think, Bennett covered it really well when they said that, we could have an outright Harris victory, we could have an outright Trump victory. What happens, congressionally also is going to matter in terms of those presidencies. But I think there is this third kind of scenario or fourth scenario around just absolute chaos in terms of the election being very, very, very close. I think it's likely that the margin is going to be very thin, and that we're going to be looking at a contested sort of reality. And we know the Electoral College is stacked against the popular vote. And so I think, what happens after November 5th is probably going to be a period of contestation and us trying to do work within certain states to make sure that we can actually do some electoral defense, some electoral justice work, where like in leading up to that point, making sure that people are not intimidated away from the polls. The kind of contestation period is already here, in my opinion. And we have states that folks can look to, that in 2020 where this happened, right, in Pennsylvania. But we're looking at Nevada, we're looking at Arizona and North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and again, Pennsylvania, as places where folks need to volunteer their time, phone bank, door knock, get out there and talk to people around the choice that folks need to make and have to make on November 5th. And so I think, the scenario planning is super important. And I think Bennett covered a lot of like what we may be facing. And I just wanted to pull on the thread around contestation, but seriously, we need folks actually on the ground, deep within communities right now, because no one sector and no one formation has the ability to pull this off on its own. And so we're going to need folks to kind of step up in this moment, because again, I think the contestation has already started, and it's important for us to figure out our role and relationship to it, to be able to have the added impact that we need.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna wrap up because we're already amazingly at now. I feel like I could continue talking with these folks forever, but unfortunately, time is limited. I do want to very quickly give each of our panelists a moment to share the organization they're in, give us a message for this moment very quickly. So I will start with Renée.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll include a little bit of an answer to the last question in my pitch, right? Which is basically, I think, obviously if Trump wins, we just I think for DSA and for Socialist Majority, both of which are sort of very open organizations, there's just not much to be done in that. One, we're probably, already infiltrated by government informants, and two, there's like no effective way to keep people out, and that's fine. But I think if Harris wins, the answer is we keep doing what we're doing because we are making strides. Like, I think that there's this sense on the left that, the Bernie moment is over and we're all in the sort of fallen afterwards. But I don't think that's true. I think if you look at the Cori, Bush, and Jamaal Bowman losses, they were, they had very specific, like, local things that AIPAC was able to seize on. And you see the left building all over the country, like making strides against sort of more moderate Democrats and against the right. And so I don't know that much changes depending on, like, if Harris wins. I think the answer is we keep doing what we're doing. And what we're doing as Socialist Majority is trying to make DSA a party surrogate that is focused on the world as it exists and building a socialist majority. We believe that the route to democratic socialism runs through convincing a majority of the people that socialism is the way. And so we are oriented towards making DSA a mass organization. And I would encourage people to go to socialistmajority.com and check us out. And then in order to join Socialist Majority, you do need to be a DSA member. And I would also suggest that people join DSA, dsausa.org, the largest socialist organization since the McCarthy era, and a interesting place to organize.
Thank you, Renee. I will pass it to Bennett.
Liberation Road is a cadre socialist organization. That means we invite people to join on the basis of relations we build through time and shared work. The best way to start a relationship, if you aren't already connected to us, is to subscribe to our newsletter. You can go to liberationroad.substack.com and subscribe there. You can also go to our website, liberation.org. We post weekly. We have periodic calls we invite people to, and there's information on there about how to get in contact with us. Other than that, my plug is join organization, build organization on the ground in the place you are. And if you are traveling someplace to support electoral work, which I hope you will do, or doing it on the ground in places where there's contests, wherever possible, do that not through the Kamala Harris campaign or not through some big thing, but either through local candidate campaign, if it's a good left candidate, or especially through a grassroots organization that can connect the work you're up to long-term base building. If you go to Seed the Vote, they're a great resource for sending folks and connecting folks to that. Movement Voter Project also has a list of their partner organizations in every state that can be a good resource for figuring out who those folks are.
Amazing. And last but not least, Jayanni.
Thank you. Yeah, North Star Socialist Organization is also a cadre organization. So much like Liberation Road, we invite people to join, and we are super majority people of color and gender oppressed organization. I think one of the last things that, I can share for myself and also for my organization is, comrades, revolution is a process. And this moment, like any other moment, is asking us to consider what we must do today to create and grow our revolutionary potential tomorrow. And so if we think about it in that way, I think there are a set of tasks that we have talked about tonight that the US left can do and should be doing and has the ability to pull off even in our weakened and fractured state. And so we know we need to block the right and build the left, that we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We can block and build and be a part of the Palestinian liberation movement to make a better future possible for everyone in this planet. And we know that we can do this, and that as a left, right, in the US, there are plenty of people counting on us to do this work well, to do this work sharply and dialectically, and to start to cohere ourselves into a formative force. And like Bennett said, we have to be in the practice of keeping hope as a part of the work both materially on the ground, and also in conversations like this where we get to share with each other and think through what makes sense in these very, very difficult times.
Thank you so much. I want to, again, thank Jayanni, Renee, and Bennett for sharing with us tonight. We will have links to all of these organizations and resources post-panel on our website, including links to the orgs that were mentioned, but also various joint efforts like the Block and Build syllabus and Socialism Beats Fascism at convergencemag.com. I encourage everyone who joined us to check out our various orgs. And if you are not already a member of an organization, to consider joining one. I will ask you, please make sure to join one. Super important because no matter the outcome of the November election, effective organization continues to be a critical responsibility for us on the left. We have a lot to learn from each other here in the US, but also from our comrades in Brazil and Mexico and beyond. Please subscribe to Convergence Magazine if you haven't already. For those joining us on YouTube, like and share and let us know your thoughts about the panel in the comments. And thank you everybody so much for joining us. Take care, be safe, and have a good night. Solidarity.